Hello, I'm Rocky Scopoletti, futurologist, author, professor, chief scientist, and board director. Welcome to this channel where I share research insights about all things to do with the fourth industrial revolution that will impact every nation, industry, organisation, and person in the world. Recently, I published my new report titled Disruptive Decarbonisation, Australia's Technological Race to Net Zero Carbon Emissions. This research report looks at the question of how can Australia increase its capacity to adapt to a world in accelerated climate change. The study was conducted across 15 industries involving more than 500 professionals, including 183 board directors and chief executive officers. This report is now available across online bookstores. In this video, I'm delighted to share with you the insights and key findings from my groundbreaking Australia 2030 research, looking at the questions of how ready Australian industries, organisations and leaders are for climate change, what challenges they face and what needs to be done by them to decarbonise their organisations and meet the new environmental targets of 43% carbon emissions reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Here are the key findings and the blueprint for how Australian organisations can increase their capacity to adapt to a world in accelerated climate change. This Australia 2030 research has identified the risk of exponential lag if Australian organisations are to meet the 2030 carbon reductions emissions target of 43%. That lag is the gap between when investment decisions are made, transformations implemented, and the time when decarbonisation benefits occur and are realised. What this means is that net zero awaits Australian businesses at the end of the exponential curve to change, not the linear curve to change. The materialisation of that risk in 2030 will further accentuate an organisation's capacity to reset onto the necessary trajectory to reach their net zero target by 2050. For Australia, that exposes investment risks for the forecasted 20 trillion of capital required by 2050, to which will need to be invested differently, be structured differently to compete in a low carbon emissions world. The research shows that the major decision-making barrier board directors and chief executives currently face is the lack of clarity around the benefits and the return on investment of their environmental programs. What I found was that this is stifling decision-making on their investment decisions. However, without question, the timing of those investment choices is now. This situation is at odds with the board director's dilemma, which is how to adapt toward the new low carbon emissions world when their organisations today are generating good returns. This is exacerbated by the facts that the costs are upfront and the dividends are back-ended. That dilemma was clearly evidenced by the facts uncovered in the Australia 2030 research that I detail in the report, and I'll summarise as the leaders to-do checklist. This includes 1. We have measures to establish. Many organisations are yet to establish their environmental strategies, policies and programs. 2, there are investments that need to be undertaken. This leaves organisations exposed by the underinvestment in the enabling technologies before they can further benefit from the emerging technologies. 3, there are emissions baselines to establish. Organisations need to urgently commence and deploy measures across their organisations to establish a carbon emissions baseline. 4, decision making to be integrated into decision making. Those measures will enable decision making to become more integrated across strategic and execution considerations. We need to shift goal setting to become strategy driven. Importantly, it will assist organisations evolve their environmental goal setting maturity from principally being compliance and risk driven to actually being strategy driven. 6, stakeholder organisation reputations that will need to be upheld. With that development, organisations will then be much better equipped to influence all stakeholder groups with their investments in their environmental initiatives that today are mostly concentrated on customers and increasing the company's brand and reputation. Given environmental programs are both data and technology intensive with highly fragmented and diverse sources, require major organisational transformations, and as such the Chief Information Officers are the key executives with the necessary leadership and skills to navigate these complexities. They will be able to orchestrate such a transformation of this scale. For Australia, the optimism that the research identified amongst those in younger demographics about the speed of technological and scientific change required to support Australia's environmental goals over the decade provides us with a cultural advantage that could deliver a demographic dividend as Australia transitions into a low carbon economy. Australia has a remarkable history of innovation. We need to remind ourselves how important it is to both look to and trust the future. With the next generation of high value adding industries emerging, Australia has a real opportunity. As an advanced economy, it can and must invest in high value added pre and post production stages of existing and emerging industries to create the new economic value. Recently, the Climate Change Authority, that is the Australian authority responsible for providing independent advice to government on climate change policy, submitted to the federal government in November its first annual progress report that has now been made public. Australia's first annual climate change statement is the government's public response to that report. In summary, it reported that Australia has turned a welcome corner in national climate and energy policy. But we have a mammoth task ahead with the stakes higher than ever. Specifically, the documents tabled in the Australian Parliament show, firstly, Australia has raised its expected emissions cut from 30% by 2030 under the previous government to now 40% by 2030 expected cut. This still falls short of the legislated 43% by 2030 target. Secondly, Australia's emissions projections in 2022 forecast that our current trajectory means that transport and fugitive emissions from fossil fuels will continue to rise, with the mining industry being the largest source of emissions in 2030. Thirdly, the government needs to drive cuts of at least 17 million tonnes of carbon a year on average in order to achieve its own target of at least 43% reduction of emissions in 2030 and net zero by 2050. The statement sends a stark warning that climate change, driven by the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas, is accelerating, with severe consequences already being felt by Australians here and now. The message from COP27 recently was clear. Experts agree that the world is still barreling toward climate catastrophe, and all economies need to do much more quickly to cut emissions this coming decade. For Australia, we need to disrupt ourselves to decarbonise our economy, which is why I felt that title was fitting for this report, because it best describes the approach we must take. This report will equip board directors, leaders, investors, policymakers and professionals with the technological insights to better understand what they need to do to mitigate the impact and risks, and explores the opportunities inherent in decarbonisation. It includes resetting strategies, investment decisions, resources, capital allocation and operational execution to respond to climate change. I welcome the opportunity to further present in-depth briefings on what these insights mean and how you can prepare your organisation and your leaders for a decarbonised fourth industrial revolution world. Let's begin the systems-led, exponentially paced and technologically enabled journey to net zero carbon emissions. And please do subscribe, like, and share this channel to anyone who may benefit from these insights. Thank you.